All right, welcome. We're going to talk about the legacy of slavery in America, and this is really not easy history. And we're going to look at it longitudinally all the way from the 16 and 1700s to its impacts on our society today. We're going to start all the way back in 16, almost 20, where the first shipment of slaves arrived in the colonies. It was a privateer ship called the White Lion that arrived with a cargo of 20 odd Negroes, and it was really this first batch of slaves that were coming with indentured servants that were doing the labor of building our new nation. By 1641, the Massachusetts legislature was the first British North American colonial body to create statutes or laws to guarantee the legality of enslaving African Americans. And after that, you saw lots of laws being passed in the colonies to regulate the actions of slaves and owners and the rights and responsibilities of owners. They included things like court ruling that basically created this definition of a slave and eliminated the ability of freemen of African descent to even use the court system to get justice, essentially. And you also have ideas that Negro children, if they were born into slavery, were automatically slaves. And this is as early as 1662. And so you have this idea that even children that have Negro mothers who were servants or slaves became property as well. So colonial laws in Virginia between 1640 and 1705 show increasing specific definitions of who could be enslaved and increasing restrictive measures to control enslaved people. These shifts in laws demonstrate some key changes in the system of slavery during the 17th century. As we move forward, you get into the Revolutionary period, and the British actually actively recruited free and enslaved black men to fight on the Loyalist side. However, many of these black loyalists had an uncertain future as the British started to retreat and were re-enslaved when they were captured by patriots. You even had 3,000 to 4,000 black loyalists who were evacuated to Nova Scotia, Jamaica, and Britain. You also have Crispus Attucks, who was this first person killed in the Boston Massacre, and there's quite a bit of discussion about whether or not he was a free person or a slave. He was described as being a mulatto. His racial makeup was in debate at this time, and so you can see here even African Americans played a role in the Revolutionary period. After the Revolutionary period, the founders got together at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 through 1789, and through a group of compromises between large states and small states in the North and the South, you get a constitution that actually actively protected slavery as an institution, including Articles 1, 4, and 5. Article 1 had the 3/5 compromise in it, which is the clause that counts 3/5 of the slave population to determine the state's representation in the House of Representatives as well as in the Electoral College. It also states in there in Article 1 that if ever a head tax were added or to be levied on the states, that the slaves would also be counted for 3/5 of a person versus a white person for taxation. So the South would essentially pay less for their slaves as well. Finally, the first article of the Constitution prohibited Congress from banning the international slave trade before 1808. And then in Article 4, you see the Fugitive Slave Clause, which requires that slaves be returned to their owners if they escape. And finally, Article 5 prohibited amendment to the slave trade or head tax clause. So they really wanted to make sure that nobody messed with those things. The Constitution essentially is creating a federal government that didn't have the power to interfere in domestic institutions of the states, and this ensured that the federal government would not or could not emancipate enslaved people, particularly in the states. So our good old Constitution sets us up to maintain slavery. You can see regional differences start to emerge in this time period. The North also had slaves, and in fact, recently there has been a black slave burial ground uncovered in New York City in a colonial cemetery, and it shows that the bodies that were interred there had evidence of African burial traditions that include ritual burying of objects that were of importance to the deceased. So even in northern cities, there was slavery. But as the North starts to rely more and more on industrialization and manufacturing and trade, and the South becomes more of an agricultural, large plantation cash crop economy, you see the shift in slavery towards the South. Additionally, you have a growing abolition movement in the North that has a lot to do with those economic differences. However, you see the expansion of slavery between 1808 and 1848. So in 1808, Congress ended legal participation in the international slave trade, but domestic slave trade expanded to fill the need for enslaved workers. A total of 1.2 million men and women from the Upper South were forcibly moved to the Deep South and the Black Belt during the first half of the 19th century. So many people were forced to make this journey that it sort of became known as the Second Middle Passage. This movement really divided families. Families were sold off, and enslaved families had generationally deep ties to the Upper South were torn apart in this forced migration. Part of this domestic slave market also meant that there were sort of racial divisions, or gender divisions, but it also reinforced racial stereotypes. Darker skinned slaves were given the hardest work out in the fields, while light skinned slaves were given domestic and skilled work, being able to interact more with their owners and white society. You had complex economic structures that begin to emerge to protect this slave trade, including insurance companies that insured slaves, auction houses, banks for credit to purchase slaves, and slaves being used as loan collateral in the sale of houses. So here you see in 1790 to 1860, the slave population shifting to the South, particularly the regions of the Deep South, and then you see auction houses being set up in towns to sell slaves in these places, slaves being advertised in newspapers, and descriptions: valuable young Negroes, field hands, the best guaranteed, cash only. The types of conditions that these slaves lived in were pretty awful, which included two different systems of slave labor. You had task systems. The task system ranked slaves by their ability to do labor. Slaves in the task system typically received fewer rations than gang labor slaves. They had to grow their own food on their free, quote, free time, although they weren't allowed to go anywhere other than their plantation. You also had gang labor, which was primarily used on cotton plantations, and this is where you see large gangs. They get up at sunrise, go out to the field, they pick till dark, and then come back to their quarters. Records were kept. This is a tally of slave tasks, a day's worth of work. Fast slaves could actually earn more free time to grow their own food, and so it behooved them to work harder and faster so that they could actually take advantage of that. Gang labor was harsh in its own right, being exposed to the elements. Children were taken out to the fields and expected to work and help at young ages, and they must maintain a continuous pace all day or get punished, basically. I'm sorry. The slaves had overseers. They were typically, especially in the gang labor tradition, impoverished white Southerners. And then they had drivers that were beneath the overseers. Those were typically enslaved men who were entrusted with supervisory powers. Oh, that was a good typo right there. Powers. So you can see here the overseers typically on horseback, but you might have some African Americans doing some leadership as the drivers. Punishments were harsh, physical, meant to terrorize everybody and keep everybody working. And they were public and they were legalized. And in fact, the laws encouraged owners to physically abuse their slaves to prevent rebellion and not working. This is a famous painting from George Washington's plantation. You can see him speaking with an overseer and slaves in the background working. Some slaves had domestic duties. Typically, the domestic slaves were kitchen women. They were kitchen workers, ladies' maids, and nannies. This type of work necessitated close and continued proximity to enslavers, and it developed and evolved into a fairly large rape culture where rape was used as a power tool to, again, instill fear in slaves. Many of the very wealthy plantation owners actually had illegitimate children with their female slaves and fathered children, and often those children would end up being in slavery after they moved into adulthood. Sally Hemings is probably the most famous of these women. She was a domestic slave in the Thomas Jefferson household. It is known that now through DNA testing that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with her. And female slaves had no legal right to refuse these unwanted sexual advances. Sally Hemings was a daughter of an enslaved woman, as were her 5 siblings, and at least 2 of her sisters also bore children with white men. Thomas Jefferson took her with him on his journeys to France and whatnot. So there's been some controversy about whether or not she was, quote, his mistress. But it's also pretty well known that she did not have the ability to ask for her freedom. While she may have been more well treated than most slaves on his plantation, she was still very much a slave. Housing for slaves, they had bulk slave quarters on these various plantations. You might have 1 to 2 families in each of these small cottages here in Georgia or in Mississippi. Cold in the winter, hot in the summer. They did have a minimal amount of supplies so that they could cook and fend for themselves, so to speak. In the South, the plantation economy evolved into a cotton economy, and this idea that cotton was king was said and promoted by James Henry Hammond. And he is quoted as saying, "In all social systems there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. It constitute the very mudsill of society." He went on to utter the oft-repeated words, "You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares make war upon it. Cotton is king." He was the Democratic governor of South Carolina in 1842, and then became the U.S. Senator from South Carolina in 1857. South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union at the start of the Civil War. King Cotton was a slogan that summarized the strategy by the South and pro-secessionists to justify this idea of secession. It was the idea that cotton exports would make the South economically independent and prosperous, and ultimately, if they seceded, they would ruin the textile industry and economy of the North. The idea was that they would potentially force France and Great Britain to support the Confederacy. Unfortunately, that never actually bore out during the war, and the North was actually very successful at preventing the Confederacy from creating diplomatic relations with Great Britain or France. The cotton gin was instrumental in causing the expansion of slavery in the South. The invention by Eli Whitney actually causes an increase in the demand for slaves in the South, because now you can plant more acreage and harvest more and make more money. So you have a large southern plantation economy that evolves in the South and continues to cause people to push further and further west as they demand more land, and causes increasing tensions in the South and Southwest as we decide whether or not those southern states would be able to have slavery. So it creates more sectional crisis. So you can see the slave and agricultural production in the South, the places that really ultimately relied on slavery, also were exporting large agricultural cash crops. Tobacco and rice in the border states. Here you have cotton here in the deep South, and moving into Texas, you can see that plays a role in the war with Mexico. You have some wheat production that's using slavery, but also sugar down in Louisiana and the Houston, Galveston area. As a result of this, you have a growing abolition movement and an increase in the number of slaves attempting to escape slavery in the years prior to the Civil War. The Underground Railroad existed from the 1830s to 1865, and it was a secret system of routes that would get escaped slaves from those border states into the North. All right. Slavery and the sectional crisis. The Civil War was about slavery, although you'll hear a lot of folks argue that it was about states' rights and federalism, going back to those anti-federalist, federalist debates. However, really, when you start to look at the sectional crisis that was occurring in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s leading up to the war, it's very clear that slavery was the key. Slavery entered into the new debates about new states entering the Union. This dealt with Missouri, Texas, California, and Kansas. It became a question of balance of power in the House and the Senate. That 3/5 compromise plays a role in that. Slavery was also crucial to U.S. foreign policy. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and its potential effect on the expansion of slavery was a key event in the sectional crisis. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, both Northerners and Southerners rushed to populate Kansas, and violence began in Kansas, resulting in Bleeding Kansas. Additionally, you had the Fugitive Slave Act, which came as part of the Compromise of 1850, which essentially created a system of bounty hunters, and nowhere in the country were black people free. Even once they moved into the northern part of the United States via the Underground Railroad, they had to keep going all the way to Canada, because the Fugitive Slave Act said that even if they were found in free territory, they could be returned to the South and put back into slavery. And even free blacks were at risk of becoming enslaved as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1857, I'll get it straight one of these days, the Supreme Court issued the Dred Scott decision. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote in the majority decision for the Supreme Court that Southern slave owners applauded, and his decision essentially established precedents related to slavery, three most important being that there was nowhere in the United States that enslaved people could be free. The court ruled that the status of enslaved people was determined by the laws in their home originating state. Traveling to a free state did not render an enslaved person free. Black people, according to Justice Taney, were not citizens of the United States, and because Dred Scott was black, Justice Taney argued that he was not a citizen and therefore he had no standing to sue. He didn't have the right to even bring a lawsuit to the Supreme Court. And ultimately, the third part was the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was essentially nullified by this Supreme Court decision, which said that slavery was restricted to territories and in below Missouri, and it essentially said that Congress did not have the power to restrict where slavery could or could not be. So this was a big setback for abolitionists, people who were fighting for freedom for slaves. So here are some fugitive slave advertisements that you would have seen in papers. This is Chief Justice Roger Taney and Dred Scott, the slave who sued for his freedom. In 1860, Lincoln was elected. The South secedes and the Civil War begins. Lincoln disliked slavery but believed the Constitution protected it where it existed. He never actually ran on a platform of freeing the slaves and said he would keep slavery or get rid of it as long as it preserved the Union. So he was more concerned about preservation of the nation as a whole, regardless of the slavery issue. After his election, 7 states seceded. The first 7 states seceded, including South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. All of them wrote sort of declarations of independence from the United States, and each of those in their declarations cite slavery and political conflict over slavery as why they left. The Confederate States of America was established in February 1861. It was never officially recognized by any other government or nation in the world, but its constitution legalized slavery. You will hear the Confederacy discussed as rebel states, and that is because even the United States never officially recognized them. So here you have an example of the Constitution of the Confederate States, and here you can see the Declaration of Independence by South Carolina, which was the first state to secede in 1860. All right, so once the war breaks out, what is the Union policy regarding slaves? Well, this evolved over time. Initially, Northern prejudice and the need to appease border states where slavery was legal within the Union made Lincoln reluctant to make ending slavery a priority of the war. However, the military, you can see these border states right here. The military did accept these slaves as contraband property and a classification that negated any legal claims of ownership by enslavers. So if people came looking for them, they were then set free and were called contraband. And this set important precedents for more general emancipation later. Eventually, 180,000 black soldiers would serve in the Union Army, and in 1862, Congress passed the Militia Act, which allowed African American men to serve actively in the Union Army. In the South, enslaved men and women and children left the plantations in large numbers. Their departures removed laborers from the fields, affecting the Confederacy's ability to supply its army and feed its citizens. It also had a dramatic impact on the Confederate morale, as the civilian population at home felt betrayed by their departure. So morale was impacted. Sometimes they were forced to even fight and help fight in the South. Many people who remained on plantations in the South colluded with Union forces to hinder the Confederate military and provided valuable information to the Union. In 1863, after much debate in the Union and among his cabinet, President Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. He is freeing rebellious slaves in rebellious states, which are not under Union control. This is important as a distinction. One, it's reflecting opposition to Lincoln's opposition to slavery and changing sentiment in the North about the necessity of ending slavery as a way to end the war and to support African American soldiers who are fighting. And also, yeah, that. I'm out of it today. All right, here we go. The next thing that comes, awkward pause. Moving on. The next thing that comes after the Civil War is Reconstruction, the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. And there was a lot of debate and argument about what Reconstruction would look like. There were lots in Congress of people called radical Republicans that wanted to see a more harsh, strict punishment of the South. Others wanted a more moderate approach. In that, though, Congress officially ended slavery through the passage of the 13th Amendment. Free people sought to exercise their freedom in the South, and so the 14th and 15th Amendments were also passed. 13th granting equal protection of the laws regardless of race, and 15th granting African Americans the right to vote. So now that these African American free people have their civil liberties and civil rights, they started to participate in different ways, which included relocation, moving away from plantations. This starts a great migration that continues into the 20th century into northern industrial cities. They started to pursue education. You had an organization called the Freedmen's Bureau, which set up schools and established education for children and adults, as well as job training. Then you see the establishment of what we now today call historically black colleges. This is your Morehouse type schools, Florida A&M. These are schools that are primarily back east and in the South, that were schools where African Americans could send their children to get a college degree. The last thing is living as families. We saw lots of families separated and segregated in this time period prior to the Civil War, so people are moving back together and staying together and allowing people to participate in politics. Between 1865 and 77, more black men served in the U.S. House and Senate, as well as in state legislatures. Freedmen's Bureau right there with all the children. But after Reconstruction, you have the beginning of Jim Crow. The black codes are passed in southern states beginning as early as 1865, the very end of the war. These were intended to restrict the freedom of movement and activities of African Americans, compelled them to work in a labor-based economy for low wages. Because of the loss of slave labor, it became very expensive to continue to do cash crop production, and so you have this new innovative type of farming called sharecropping or tenant farmers, which is much like feudalism, where people paid rent and had to grow a certain amount of crops, essentially forcing slaves back onto the land. These local legislatures also passed vagrancy laws, and these were laws that would punish African Americans for minor infractions and force them back into labor. The 13th Amendment says that you are free from servitude, involuntary servitude, unless convicted of a crime. So this was a way to get around the 13th Amendment. And then you have the convict lease system. So once you were arrested, then you could be literally leased by the prison to local farmers, businesses as chain gangs. So you can see African Americans incarcerated and they're literally chained together so they can't run away. In addition, you have the growth of the KKK as a terrorist organization. They used fear to terrorize African Americans who sought educational, political power, or economic success, and they used lynchings as public events. They grew in strength. By the 20th century, they are very large and had huge numbers in 73 years. Huge numbers of lynchings, and you can see in the late 1800s those numbers spike in the South as a way to intimidate people. So what is our legacy of slavery? It is racial segregation and racism still persists today. You see this in housing and education, sports, churches, and policing. Economic inequality stratify American society. Our playing field isn't level, and race is also not a genetic thing, but a social construct. So here you can see blacks are far more likely to drop out than whites of high school and less likely to graduate from high school. The median income in 2016, African Americans are down at the bottom, Hispanics are near the bottom.